There's a venomous lizard living in the American desert that only eats twice a year. Twice. It can go months without a feed and barely notice, because somewhere in its biology is a molecule that switches off hunger. Scientists have worked out how to adapt that molecule, and it's now sitting in the fridges of millions of people around the world in the form of GLP-1s with brand names including Ozempic, Wegovy and Mounjaro. The USA Today show recently reported at least 32 high-profile names including Oprah, Amy Schumer, Serena Williams, James Corden and Charles Barkley have admitted that they're taking GLP-1s, and most of them could not tell you the first thing about how they work. So, what is happening inside your body when the weight falls off? Why do so many people pile it back on the moment they stop taking it? And what decisions should you ask yourself before just lining up for a jab that proclaims to do so much physically and psychologically? We've invited Dr. Tom Buckley back into the studio to have this science-based conversation with me. More than 30 years in medicine, a professor at Sydney University and co-author of the best-selling book Match Fit, Dr. Tom goes deep on the science and the mechanisms behind these drugs. This isn't a quick fix episode. Our goal is to help with making an informed decision before you or someone you know really well starts taking GLP-1s. This is the show that brings potential into everyday life. This is Performance Intelligence.
It's quite a complex topic, isn't it? And very topical at the moment. And today in this discussion, I'm going to take a very scientific view of the topic around excess food, minimizing food, what the mechanism of control is, and then where this drug, which is a revolutionary drug, let's be honest about it. I mean, I think you and I have had many chats about it. But let's look at it from a scientific perspective, because whenever you speak about weight or whenever you speak about food, it immediately has an emotional aspect to it. And for some people, even more can be a higher emotional aspect. So I want to take quite a scientific view of that. So what you just read out there is actually fact, in that is where we are in society, and that is where a lot of discussion is. And a lot of people are using this particular product to enhance their well-being with great success.
And the iteration of this conversation, just to let people know the evolution of our coaching, the conversations we've had behind the scenes. You and I have had numerous conversations with some of our clients who've asked us about this. And we had a workshop a couple of weeks ago where we sat down with our senior leader and really mapped out what we're going to go through today. And that is, number one, what GLPs are and the physiology behind them. Number two, the evidence we have, evidence around weight loss, regeneration, cognitive function. And number three, and this was a really interesting discussion that we've had with a couple of people really wanting informed information on this, not the pop psychology. What do you need to do if you're on them, and what do you need to do if you come off them? And I've learned a lot, sitting sidecar with you. So now we want to bring this to our mainstream audience. So let's start with number one. What are GLPs?
So GLP, when we talk about GLP, we're talking about GLP-1 receptor agonists. These are medications. There is some debate whether it's a peptide or a medication, but I think they're regulated as a medication. And the GLP is a medication that mimics some processes that naturally happen in the body. So G is glucagon, the L is for like, and the peptide is the P, and then peptide 1. So it's a glucagon-like peptide. Now, I will talk about glucagon in a minute and insulin, but even though it's called a glucagon-like peptide, it actually doesn't act like glucagon, and it's actually called that because it has some of the similar molecular structure to glucagon, but it does have some interaction with glucagon. So it's a glucagon-like peptide. It's one of two what's called incretin hormones that are switched on or off when we eat food. And the biological effect of that is it has an effect on how we either feel full, how quickly we empty the food that we eat out of our digestive system, and it also has an effect of lowering blood sugar. And when we put them together, we also see weight loss as part of that. And part of that mechanism, of course, has to do with appetite. Now, I've thrown out a few big words there. So glucagon is a peptide in the body, and glucagon is something that we produce naturally. right? And it's a peptide hormone, theoretically, and it's produced by the pancreas, the alpha cells in the pancreas, and it works to increase blood sugar. So when we fast, glucagon kicks in, increases blood sugar, and helps to make sure we have energy, and that mechanism through the liver. Opposite to glucagon, we have insulin. And we talk a lot about insulin resistance, reducing insulin. You and I are always talking to our clients about looking at insulin levels, reducing insulin. And insulin is actually responsible for lowering blood sugar. So it helps to transport glucose into the cells. And so we have this balancing, homeostatic balancing with our blood sugar, where glucagon will kick in if we need to produce glucose from the liver, and insulin will help to lower glucose. And that glucostatic mechanism is also has a role in our appetite. And Andrew, whenever you have a really high glucosey or high sugary meal, what often happens to you quite quickly afterwards?
And what happens to me, what happens to my kids is there's a spike, there's an insulin spike, and then there's a corresponding crash after. But the spike, you can have erratic behavior, your brain's a little bit fragmented, energy levels up, and then once you digest that, and we're going to talk about hormones like leptin and ghrelin, I'm sure, today, then the corresponding crash, you're much lower energy levels where you were. So it's a short-term, is it a gain, in inverted commas, and then long-term you crash. So it's a science lesson, ladies and gentlemen, and that's what we want to do today, because it's all too easy, as we've had with a few of our clients. Hey, my doctor said I should go on Mounjaro, I should go on Ozempic. Hey, whoa. Let's understand the physiology. And Dr. Tom's even just started taking us through that. And this is, we found with some of our conversations, really important that people have a full balanced view. Then they can make an informed decision rather than, hey, go to my doctor, get a jab, everything's fixed. No, it's not. And I'm going to go through some of the case studies on that. If you don't change behavior, as well as look at the physiology, when people come off it, they tend to be worse off because they've lost muscle mass, metabolism's down, and they're in a worse state. So this is a really complex topic.
And that's why I'm starting with some of the basics. And listeners might say, oh, come on, Tom, get to the drug. But actually, if you understand the basics, there's ways you can maximize the use of the drug, or there's ways you can get to the lowest, most effective dose of the drug rather than doing too much trial and error. So we've got this balance between glucagon and insulin regulating our blood sugar. So that's one mechanism. Another mechanism we have is what we call the hunger hormone, ghrelin, which you just mentioned there, Andrew. And that's produced in the stomach, specifically in the gastric fundus. Small amounts produced in the small intestine, the brain, the pancreas. And its primary action here is to stimulate appetite. So it signals the hypothalamus in the brain to eat. So our levels naturally spike when your stomach is empty.
I tell you what, you put me on our 21-day liver cleanse. Ghrelin was knocking on my door. Hello, Ghrelin, my friend. It's interesting, isn't it? It's hunger and the hormone balance around it. But I feel, so N equals 1, and I think society, we don't look at hunger anymore like it's part of evolution. It's a mechanism. It is good. It's digestion. Now, if we look at fasting for different groups we work with, you're getting autophagies. There's some real benefits of embracing hunger, but we tend to feed our emotions and then go, oh, I'm going to swallow that up. And then you get this whole rise in insulin, and it's just like a merry-go-round, isn't it?
Yeah, and I do want to talk about the evolutionary aspect. And so, when you were doing your detox, it takes about 3 or 4 days for that ghrelin level to settle down and understand what's going on. And then that hunger goes away. And I think that's an important learning for people whenever they change their diet, is that it can be 3 or 4 days before the ghrelin leptin balance actually settles out. And for some people, it may never, which is why they have to look at other ways of managing hunger. So we have the ghrelin that stimulates appetite, but then we have leptin. You mentioned leptin earlier. And leptin is produced by the adipose tissue, the fat stores in our body, smaller amounts in the stomach and skeletal muscles. And that signals the brain that you have had enough to eat. So that feeling of fullness, and it sort of regulates our long-term energy balance and suppresses our appetite. So we have 2 mechanisms I've talked about. We've talked about the blood sugar regulation, balancing that. And then we have the hunger hormone ghrelin with the satiety hormone leptin, balancing almost depending on how much is in your stomach. And so those mechanisms are really important, because they're the 2 mechanisms now that are targeted with the GLP drugs. And so if we look at what the GLP is then, so it's that glucagon-like peptide medication that actually switches on and off. Now, when you eat a big meal, then GLP-1 is stimulated, but it's for a very short period of time. Yeah. And what they actually discovered was the research that came from this initially actually came from a lizard. You may have heard the story about this venomous lizard in the desert. And what they discovered...
I haven't heard this one. Every time we talk, I'm writing notes profusely and learning. So talk to me about this lizard.
So they discovered this lizard, and the name of it, I'm frantically trying to find the name of it because it has a horrible name.
We'll call him Lenny the lizard. How's that?
What they discovered with what we'll call Mr. Lizard is that he only eats about twice a year. And what they discovered was that he had a molecule that regulated the hunger and regulated the blood sugar very, very steady over long periods of time. In other words, they didn't have the hunger that drove the lizard to eat like us humans, because they had a molecule that was very similar to the GLP-1 in humans. And what we knew with GLP in humans is that when it's stimulated after eating, it only stays up for short periods. And what they discovered was that if they could mimic the same mechanism pharmaceutically that the lizard has, you could actually get that GLP to remain elevated for long periods. And thus, we're now at a stage where we have GLPs where you take it once a week and the GLP level stays up for a week, and therefore the hunger is suppressed for almost a week. And so that was the revolutionary aspect of developing these drugs. Now, they were originally developed, of course, for blood sugar regulation. But of course, there's a strong interaction between blood sugar regulation and appetite, and a strong regulation between blood sugar regulation and insulin secretion. And of course, laying down of adipose tissue fat requires insulin and excessive sugar in the body. So if you look at where the drug is blocking that pathway, it makes sense then that this drug, the mechanism of action of this actually is to increase insulin, which will lower blood sugar. It slows down gastric emptying, so you feel full, mechanically feel full longer because the GLP-1 is higher in the body. It suppresses glucagon, which is responsible for producing glucose. So it's telling the body, it's actually almost artificially telling the body you're in a more starved, you don't need to eat. So it's suppressing that hunger, and it does that through slowing gastric emptying. So what you've got here is this mechanical process stimulated by a chemical process.
So we'll do a summary. We've got that balance between glucagon and insulin. We've got the leptin and ghrelin balance between satiety and hunger. And we've got a lizard named Lenny who only eats twice a year that stimulated scientists to look at what's going on. Now, I've got to put on my exercise physiologist hat, Dr. Tom. It's a bit dusty. I don't get to put on the ex-phys hat a lot these days. It's more the psychology, culture change, leadership hat. But I know there's natural ways to stimulate GLP-1. That one of my concerns around this, anytime I'm asked a question or we're asked questions in our workshops, is yes, this mechanism works and that's why we're going through it, but you can also work your body naturally. So what's your thoughts on that? When someone just looks at this quick fix, what are you telling people to try and do naturally to stimulate GLP-1?
Yeah, I absolutely will go through them. I'm just going to caveat it with something that we evolutionary for 99.9% of human time on Earth, we have evolutionary developed from an environment and a lifestyle that has gone through hunger periods, either in the day, in the week, in the month, or across the year. So our biology has evolutionary developed through hunger, which that physiology I just spoke about actually, and I spoke about how these things interact with the brain, because that actually drives emotion. It also drives drives to find food. So evolutionary, the people who survived from an evolution perspective were the people who are able to store fat. So when we talk about having excessive fat on the body, it's actually our natural evolutionary mechanism. The fact that it can be difficult to turn down hunger in many, many people is part of the evolutionary. So we are actually evolved to live in a different environment to the one we now live in, this post-industrial revolution. and more recently, technological revolution. So that's the first thing I just want to caveat, that we tend to think of putting on fat as all a behavioral thing, when actually it's a evolutionary biology interacting with the lifestyle that we naturally live in a Western world. So just to caveat that, if you go back to the mechanism of how the body naturally stimulates GLP-1, well, it's naturally stimulated when we eat. Now, it's the mechanical process of eating. So when we eat foods that are high in fiber, that have a lot of lean protein in it, that have adequate healthy fats in it, that actually stimulates GLP-1 because it actually stays in our digestive system longer. So therefore, the GLP remains higher longer. Whereas when we eat very high sugary, quick processed foods that go through us very quickly, then GLP is the response is much shorter, and so therefore the hunger comes back quick, and that's seen in the insulin spike you spoke. So the first thing is that when I work with clients, and I know you do, I'm always talking about getting enough fiber in. I'm always talking about getting adequate lean protein in, getting adequate lean fats in, particularly omega-3 fatty acids, your olive oils, your avocado, your nuts, getting lots of the fiber. Remembering that fiber, particularly things that are in barley, beans, lentils, and fermented foods, they actually feed the bacteria in your gut. And so now you are actually directly triggering GLP release. And then there are a couple of other things. We know exercise does it, regular exercise does, particularly brisk walking, low intensity exercise, boost GLP. And as a matter of fact, Andrew, I've often said to you, whenever I do intermittent fasting, if I exercise, the hunger goes away. So it's all that mechanism of stimulating GLP. Then there are supplements that we often discuss with clients. Berberine is one you often hear me talking to clients about. Very good for blood sugar regulation, but also that mechanism, once again, GLP-1, blood sugar regulation, works very similar to how metformin does. Turmeric as well, green tea. So they've all been shown to stimulate GLP-1, and they are the things that we do with well, I do, and I know you do with our clients around actually normalizing your physiology. Because one of the things that's doing the most damage to us, and you've heard me on stage talk about this again and again and again, one of the things that's doing the most damage to us is excess nutrition, and particularly excess nutrition at nighttime. And if you think about everything we've talked about here, about how our metabolic balance, our blood sugar regulation, Ghrelin leptin balance, GLP, we're actually swimming upstream the way we live. Eating these big meals at night, metabolizing them across the night, having this GLP-1 mechanism. We're continuously eating, trying to deny hunger, which is interfering with the GLP mechanism.
I can't help but think, as you were growing up a young lad in Ireland, and I was growing up in Wagga, Gleninus, Dubbo, yes. So hello to our country New South Wales audiences. Our parents collectively were telling us the formula for what we now, some of our clients say, get paid a lot of money to tell really intelligent people basic shit that they know but they don't do. Eat lean protein. Have some carbs. Back then we called performance carbs. Eat heaps of vegetables. Don't drink too much. Have some good fats. Don't be an asshole. Exercise. Balance stress. A very wise man, I heard say, Dr. Tom, in Auckland at a leadership program, a leadership capacity program with a large bank a couple of months ago, said you need to become the CEO of your body and brain. Now, when you said that, I noticed nearly everyone in the audience in that leadership group wrote that down. And it was that light bulb moment for a lot of the people in the room that, they run a bank, they're great on KPIs and metrics and cash flow and funding. But you've got to also be the CEO of your body and brain. And it's really important. Any of the discussions we've had collectively, I've had, you've had separately with people, it's not just a quick fix. You don't just go past go, get $200. You've got to go on the other steps of the Monopoly board. And this is the first bit, to actually have a knowledge around what's happening, what's the mechanism around this. It's the basic tenets that we wrote about in MatchFit. It hasn't changed in 5 years. Move, fuel, recharge, think, connect, and play. I want to go to another bit of information in our research from popular culture. Comedian Chelsea Handler. Do you like Chelsea Handler?
I could pretend I know who Chelsea Handler is, but I don't.
The look on your face just said, no, you got no idea. She's a Chelsea Handler. It's a very funny female comedian. She said,
my doctor, my anti-aging doctor, just hands it out to anybody, right? I didn't even know I was on it.
So it has been prescribed to so many people by doctors, and we've seen that so many people have a little understanding of the physiology and the mechanism. So we've covered that. Is there anything else you want to talk about in the physiology?
Yeah, I think two things. One is that, like a lot of new therapies, there seems to be a bit of a stigma around using the GLP drugs. And
you and I initially were like, oh God, I was like, because it was this whole quick fix, beat up.
Yeah, well, look, semaglutide, which is one of the sort of second generation of these drugs, and there's lots of trade names for that. But that drug's been around for a while, and these drugs have been used in helping patients to manage their type 2 diabetes for a long time. So I've had exposure to them clinically for a long time. So I can see, I think what's happened is they've become popularized through weight loss. But there's a couple of things we need to bear in the back of our mind. One is this evolutionary need to store food and store fat for lean times. Some people have a higher genetic pull in that area than others. Yeah, because we tend to look at obesity and sort of blame the person, another stigma for being overweight. A lot of our lifetime body weight is actually determined in our teens and adolescent years. And often what our body habitus looks like then is often what we end up with dealing across our life. So there's we could discuss that forever. Two important things, I think. You will find in those with obesity that their response, particularly to carbohydrates, is completely different to non-obese individuals. In other words, there is a physiological underpinning that's probably a genetic trait that's at play there. So the blame game of you ate yourself to that size thing really annoys me, because actually it is swimming upstream big time for them. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, and I didn't really appreciate this much, I heard you speaking to Dr. Paul Batman once about this, and it triggered me, it stayed in me for a long time. Then I looked into it a lot, getting ready for this. We don't actually lose the fat cells. They actually shrink. And so it's really important here, this thinking about that I'm losing fat. You're losing the size of the fat cells. They shrink. So therefore, there's also the potential for them to expand again down the road. So we just got to bear that in the back of our mind, that we tend to hang on to those cells. It's just they're not swollen up and big and full, they're shrunk. And that's really, really important, because when we talk about losing weight, we're always thinking that we've lost the fat out of the body, we've lost the size of the fat cells out of the body, but we can actually lose the muscle cells. And so that's something we've got to think about here when we think about weight loss. But I did want to make that point too. And the other point too is that there is a strong interaction between food and emotions. And let's be honest, eating food is one of the most pleasurable things in life. And for some people, that can go both ways, in that they need the food to maintain their mental well-being, and often their mental well-being will dictate what they eat. So when we talk about the physiology, we have to immediately think about the psychology and the emotional reaction too.
I get that. I am an emotional eater. I've managed that. I think learning that a number of years ago was the first step, because as a middle distance runner in my 20s, and then got onto the bike in my 30s, and I was a corporate athlete. You can outrun, outswim, outpaddle some shitty food and alcohol, and then you turn 40 and then suddenly you can't outrun, outpaddle, outswim. You got to totally change what you eat, lift heavy shit, do sauna, all the mechanisms we're talking about. I get the emotional eating, and it can be good and bad. Like, it can be celebration, oh, let's have some food, or it can be, hey, commiseration, let's have some food. So the emotional regulation piece is really important around this. And when we get to part 3, what people do when they go on it and if they come off, I see that as the big trigger that's not adapted or not spoken about anywhere near enough, that I've got this quick fix, as loads of our research shows, but then people come off it. They haven't changed the behavior. They haven't got an understanding or awareness about the emotions. And you explained that about the fat cells, or Dr. Paul Batman. Hello, Paul. Yeah, that was illuminating. I can remember sitting here in this studio when that dropped, because we used to think you'd lose fat cells, but Paul said, no, we were wrong. Your fat cells just shrink. So you can fill them up quite quickly again. Hey, one thing I wanted to chat about, and I've seen this with a couple of people I know. I've seen this with people in the media. In fact, another quote was from Boy George. Do you like Boy George, Dr. Tom?
I love his music.
He's got some great songs.
Oh, yeah.
He's also produced a number of hits I didn't realize. Like he's a serious behind the scenes guy as well. Anyway, Boy George said, I started on Ozempic and switched to Mounjaro. Trust me, anyone who was fat last year and is now skinny is on the wonder drug. That's where you often see a celebrity and their face shrinks. So I wanted to ask you about that and get the guidance, because I've seen this in the media and some people I know where they get that Ozempic or that really sort of skinny face.
Yeah, my understanding with that, because I've had people ask me that before around, does my jawbone structure change? And no, it doesn't. It's more the rapid weight loss can change the shape of the structures around your neck and your jaw. So, and I think that, when I listen to a lot of experts speaking about this, who run clinics using the GLPs, they'll always say that if you want to maintain your facial structure, you've got to lose weight very, very slowly. And that would be advice. I had somebody last week asking me advice. They were saying their doctor about it, and I was saying slowly, steady wins the day. And particularly so you can allow your facial structures to adapt. What often happens is you lose a lot of the fat cells shrink, and then the skin hasn't had time to catch up, and then your jawbones become more prominent, and you get that square looking. Some people want that. Brilliant. They look in the mirror, they're really happy with it.
The looks max has apparently tapped the jaw. You know the saying, ass or face? It's one of the old weight loss sayings. I heard a lot of my female clients say this over the years as well. Get to a certain age and they don't want to be too skinny, so you keep a little bit more on the backside so the face doesn't look too skinny. I've seen this with men also. If you are too lean, God, I look back at some photos of myself and some of my middle distance mates 15 years ago. We look younger now, because we just had no fat on our face. So it is something to be conscious of. Not ass versus face, just getting the balance right.
Yeah, I saw a picture of myself 15 years ago, just after finishing an Ironman. And I remember at the time I was 11 kilograms lighter than I am now. I remember at the time you saying to me one day, you look like a schoolboy. So I think, your body shape can be fit for purpose sometimes. For me, it was being really skinny and lean to do a 10-hour race. I think when we get older, having some subcutaneous fat is quite protective. It's the visceral adipose tissue fat. It's that fat in around the abdomen and the organs. That's the fat you want to shrink, because that's like a tumor and it's bioactive. It grows out. Thank God it grows out, because if it grew in, it would press on organs. It grows out like a tumor. That's the fat you want to get rid of. The subcutaneous fat that we have around the shoulders, back, neck, that's not bioactive. And if anything, as we get older, it's quite protective. Gives you some reserves and a little bit of padding if you fall over.
So I think we'll close that out on the physiology and what happens, because we could be here for hours. I really do want to talk about the evidence we're seeing. And I'll start with, again, N equals 2, you and I, what we've seen with a few of our clients. Yes, it's the weight loss. Yes, it's the physical changes. But we've had some people report that they feel almost like Brad Cooper in Limitless. It's this cognitive function. And that research I said at the start of this episode from the Washington Post about people taking these GLP-1s and just saying, I have this absolute increase in cognitive horsepower. So let's unpack that. Let's look at what we're seeing, the physical changes, the psychological, and if there's any other changes in the intersection between those two.
So I think with any drug or any behavior, when somebody says it does this and this and this and this and this and this and this, I immediately, doubting Tom always jumps in and says nothing can be that good if it's. But if you think about it, and you think about regulating blood sugar very well, think about actually the data on undernutrition, particularly in the animal studies, increasing lifespan, reducing cardiovascular outcomes, etc., then it doesn't becomes surprising when we see here that we have a chemical that's actually able to replicate some of those effects that what we see. So let me just run through what we see, because we have a tremendous amount of evidence now. So the first thing is blood sugar regulation. I mean, we've got 76 randomized controlled trials with nearly 40,000 patients in it. And what you see is massive reductions in blood sugar, average HbA1c, the average blood sugar over the last 2 to 3 months. We're seeing up to about a 2% on average reduction. And that's massive. That is massive. That is, clinically highly significant. And there's slight variation between the different medications, but overall, we've known that semaglutide is incredibly effective at reducing blood sugar. So that's the first thing. That would be a primary reason to use these drugs in somebody who's got type 2 diabetes and may be on metformin already. It may not be adequately managing their blood sugar. And knowing that high blood sugar is associated with bad things, particularly macrovascular things like cardiovascular disease and eye disease and kidney disease, it would make sense to regulate blood sugar. So then you have to look at the literature on major adverse cardiovascular events, because you would say, we know high blood sugar is associated with higher risk cardiovascular events, such as heart attacks and strokes and even cardiovascular death. And as a 2024 systematic review in Lancet, one of the most prestigious medical journals, has shown what I think is revolutionary reductions in cardiovascular events. So overall reductions of about 20% risk reduction, the highest being about 25%. And that's seen in major trials. And we're talking about 20-25% reduction.
That's a massive reduction, 20 to 25%. That's significant.
25% risk of a heart attack, 30% risk of stroke, and about 15% reduced cardiovascular death. Now, it makes sense to me physiologically, if you think about early on this podcast, thinking about the mechanisms and interactions in our physiology, knowing that high blood sugar is one of the main risk factors, but so is accumulation of adipose tissue fat. And we put them together, you start to see that risk. And when you reduce them, we see a reduction in risk. Other things seen, there are trials going on right now looking at heart failure, fatty liver disease, obstructive sleep apnea, osteoarthritis, and even some of the neurodegenerative diseases. I think the evidence is still emerging there. And while I could pick one study and say, wow, they're very mechanistic studies at this time, but what it is saying to me is that these drugs are actually regenerative. So they're helping to balance the physiology, which would have a regenerative effect. And what is that regenerative effect? Well, it's reduction in blood sugar, it's probably reduction in inflammation, and a more homeostatic balance. So it doesn't surprise me to see these outcomes beyond weight in our cardiovascular risk, stroke risk, and also reductions in things like risk of kidney failure as well. And actually, most of the drugs are not toxic on the kidney, so you don't expect these drugs to have a problem with people's kidneys.
I'm going to be a little bit controversial. Let's go 5 years from now. You have been following this. So while this has hit mainstream press the past couple of years, your work at Sydney University, your work at North Shore Hospital, you've been in theatre for 30 years, in medicine for 30 plus years. So you understand the mechanism. In 5 years' time, I'm assuming this will be available in a tablet format. You said before, looking at the smaller dose, or what we call MED, the minimum effective dose. So if this is available in a pill, a potion, a bottle, or a lotion in 5 years for minimum effective dose, so just go through those benefits to decrease your blood sugars, to decrease inflammation, to look at homeostatic balance. We've spoken about increasing brain connectivity with that salience network, and to decrease risk of heart attack and stroke. Elevation to an executive team, elevation to a leadership team. Why would you not put somebody on this?
I mean, I think there's a general principle in medicine around always looking at non-medicine approaches to management before you move to medicine approaches, because irrespective of what the drug is, I don't know of any drug that doesn't have potential side effects. What we don't know here is the long-term effects.
It's too early, moving from diabetic patients to mainstream.
It's interesting because to me, I can see that that actually the benefits would outweigh the risk. It's just trying to identify who are the risky people. So, if you're somebody who's prone to pancreatitis, this isn't the drug for you. If you're somebody who's got a history of thyroid cancers in the family and you're at risk, this isn't the drug for you, because we've got a couple of GLP receptors in the thyroid glands. And in the animal studies, rodents have a lot of GLP receptors in the thyroid glands, and there's been some concern about the effects of the GLPs on the thyroid in rodents. Us humans have very few GLP receptors there, but it's one thing that your doctor would be conscious of before they would prescribe this. And the key message here is this should be prescribed by a medical practitioner who knows everything about you, either a medical practitioner or a nurse practitioner, but somebody who's working with you and has done your medical checks. So it won't be for people with pancreatitis. It won't be for people who are prone to thyroid disease. And then if we look at some of the adverse effects of it, most people will get nausea, vomiting, and some diarrhea with it. But particularly the nausea can be quite difficult. Now, some of the newer versions of the drugs, they work on two receptors, not just a GLP, seems to have overcome a lot of that. But that makes sense, because if food stays in your GI system longer, which is what these drugs are doing to help you feel full and to quench hunger, then we do tend to feel a bit nauseous from that. People do tend to get used to that. I think some of the meta-analysis on that showed about 20%, so 1 in 5 people will have some gastrointestinal adverse effects. Maybe up to a quarter will have nausea, vomiting less so. But people do get used to that and titrate the dose up and down. So I think you're back to your question again, there will be people where this is absolutely revolutionary because they will actually be able to become more functional from the weight loss. I think we, in 5 years' time, will know a lot more about what is that minimum effective, most effective dose. I think we'll know who are those people that shouldn't be on it. There is one randomized trial. Once again, I don't like to lean on one trial, but there have been studies showing about a 2 to 3% reduction in bone mineral density over 1 year, which I think is clinically meaningful in one study. So
meaning if someone is just going on a GLP-1 and they're not lifting weights, they're not doing weight-bearing activity, if they're losing 2 or 3% bone density, that's going to be a much higher likelihood of having osteoporosis and then further complications as they age.
Yeah, I think if you're somebody who's prone and I think it may be worth knowing what your bone mineral density is before you start these drugs, particularly if you've got a history of one of the osteoporosis. So I think from that perspective, some of the systematic reviews have shown an odds ratio of about 1 risk of pancreatitis. So that's, perhaps 1 in 100 people like it. And so, your doctor or your nurse would be looking out to see if you're getting any signs of that. There's always concerns around gallbladder diseases. I think the absolute risk of that seems to be around 1% as well in trials. Gastric reflux is probably about 2% of people get gastric reflux. Gastric reflux is probably manageable, but really important if you're having an operation and having an anesthetic, that your anesthetist knows you're on these medicines, because obviously if the food is not moving through your GI system as quick, then you'd be more likely to aspirate food. So I think we'll get better in 5 years at knowing what the dose is, who they should, and we might get better at weaning people off as well.
So a couple of open loops. One is a lot of what you've gone through, some of the risk factors. Would this potentially be counterbalanced with genetic testing? And I look at what we do with our executive clients. We do what's called a human performance assessment. So they get a pathology form from Dr. Tom. They go to a lab. We look at all the blood profiles. So often it's just cholesterol. So they look at LDL, HDL, triglycerides. You go deeper. You mentioned before HbA1c. So we're looking at insulin in the blood. We're looking at inflammation markers. We look at vitamin D. We're looking at DHEAX, the precursor to testosterone. So it's a real panel. And I've seen this, been sidecar with you for years. And you said to me many, many, many years ago, show me someone's heart rate, show me their blood, I'll tell you exactly what's going on. So I see that with you in our high-end executive programs. I see that in the coaching we do. Do you see that someone's going to be able to go and get a genetic profile? And there are a whole bunch of companies out there that do this now. And then that could counterbalance some of the risk. Is that where we're going?
We do know some of the genetic SNPs that are associated with blood sugar regulation. We also know the ones that are associated with weight gain, with inability to metabolize certain nutrients. So we do know those. I think ultimately, when you see expression of that in the physiology, you'll see expression of that through some of the outputs of the liver, cholesterol, blood sugar, ferritin levels, inflammatory markers. You'll start to see that. And I think, if people are unable to regulate their weight, maybe don't have as much control over nutrition, unable to exercise, some people just not able to exercise for medical or physical reasons, then I think there's going to be a place for medicines like this. They're not going away, Andrew. I actually think one of the highest prescribed medicines in the Western world right now is statins for reducing cholesterol. This one's going to overtake it in 5-10 years' time.
One other open loop. You mentioned the studies on rodents. I've worked with a number of rodents in the corporate world over the years.
Just to say that a lot of the studies done on rodents, they're very good for learning mechanisms, but they don't always translate to humans. And so they're not mini humans. And a lot of scientists I work with will go to painstaking to say, actually, we can show mechanisms and we can show safety, but we have always got to test them in humans. These drugs have been tested in humans for a long, long time. I mean, I'm talking about 200-300 randomized trials, and overall they have been shown to be safe in the short term. So it's just those couple of people that we know, the pancreatitis or people who might be prone to thyroid cancer, they're the ones who definitely wouldn't be prescribed these. But we know these are quite safe drugs, and if they're prescribed and monitored safely, to me, I see more upside than downside.
What do people need to do when they're on GLP-1s, and what do they need to be really wary of, conscious of when they come off them? And we'll talk a bit about behaviour change.
So I think the first thing is that you really do want to think about what your motivation for being on the drug is and what you're trying to achieve. If you're a slim person going on this to become slimmer, you do have to ask questions around what is your ideal body weight, and is that your motivation? Because as I say, you don't lose fat, you shrink the fat, but you do lose muscle. And muscle's protective, and muscle's predictive of longevity. Muscle's also used to power our brain. As you know, you always talk about all the different molecules that when we exercise muscles, they create. We know grip strength is predictive of longevity. We know brain neurotropic factors released from muscles when we exercise. So we do need to protect muscle. So the first thing that we need to think about is, if we're shrinking fat, we don't just shrink it on its own. We will lose muscle, and always a risk of losing some bone mineral density. And so the first thing is
skeletal muscle as well makes you metabolically active. Skeletal muscle is a really important part of aging. Skeletal muscle is why we say to people, lift heavy shit a couple of times a week, because often it's grandpa falls over and they break their hip, and then you hear 3 months later they've gone because they just didn't have that structure, that strength, and something like a broken hip can be the tipping point. So that's a balance that I've been wrestling and trying to learn through this discussion with you, because it's not stripping away fat cells, it's shrinking them, but then people are also losing muscle. You said they can also lose some bone density. So it's a strip of everything, which is a big risk if you're not managing this properly.
And what I've said to clients I work with, because I do think these drugs can revolutionize people's lives, it really can. And we've seen that, is that you must be exercising, and you must be maintaining your muscle mass. You will lose muscle mass no matter what you do, but you need to focus on, you've got to be doing strength and resistance work. You absolutely have to be doing it. The second thing that you have to be doing, and this is really, really important, the human body is used to and has evolved over millions of years to have spikes in GLP-1. It goes up and down, up and down. Yeah, it's not evolved to have GLP-1 in the system all the time. And I don't know what the long-term effect of that will be. Maybe we'll all turn into venomous lizards or something. Joke. But the reality is we now must be very conscious that our hunger is suppressed. And we mustn't just be eating the comfort foods for our emotions, because there's a small group of people who go on these drugs where they've lost that emotional comfort or mood regulation effect of foods. And what they will tend to do then is I'm not very hungry, but I'll have my 2 chocolate bars instead of supper. And if you do that, you're going to be missing out on micronutrients, omega-3 fatty acids, all the micronutrients and stuff. So, you alluded to it very early on. It's an adjunct. It's not the cure. It's an adjunct. You have got to really focus on quality nutrition, particularly, and if you get enough fiber in, enough omega-3 fatty acids in, and enough vegetables, broad vegetables, multicolored vegetables, so you're getting all the sort of micronutrients we need in, then you can get away with low levels of nutrition.
Can I add one other one? I think this is missing, and I see this missing in lots of the research. I see this missing in lots of the popular press conversations as well. It's the inside job, or looking at the psychological skills around this. And this sounds so simple, but a couple of people I've spoken to got stuck. Level 1, when we're asking a question, is why. So why do you want to, or why would you want to go on a GLP-1? Well, I want to lose weight. Why is that important? Well, I want to have more confidence. Why is that important? And it's not, Dr. Tom, until we sometimes get into that 4th or 5th layer that true reason comes out. So I want to feel more confident. Why is that important? Well, I'd actually like to be in a room and not be wasting energy, draining all this energy, worried about, FOPO, fear of other people's opinion, and think that I'm not holding this space. I had a similar conversation to this a couple of months ago. Why is that important? Well, I actually think that might be holding me back. Where is that holding you back? Well, I feel embarrassed when I'm with my kids at soccer on a weekend. Why do you feel embarrassed? And this guy looked at me and said, fuck me, mate. Is it you just give me the simple solution? No, let's keep going. And I held that pressure point. And you've been in the room when we've done co-coaching, you see me do this. It's uncomfortable for the person you're talking to, but it's essential that you get into that deeper layer. Well, why that's important? I love my kids, and I want to be a positive role model for my kids, and I want to have a healthier, longer life. And okay, now we're starting to get some reasons other than just this aesthetic tick the box. Then balance with that. What are you going to do to change your behaviour? What do you mean? So go back to your kids' footy. When you're feeling overweight and ashamed, what do? I tuck into a pie and have a can of Coke because I'm an emotional eater and that feeds my emotions. Okay, so a jab or in a couple of years a tablet. It's not going to fix that deep-seated cognition or that schema, that collection of thoughts that you've had for decades and decades. This is a really important part, Tom, that I just don't see getting anywhere near enough airtime.
There are discussions that should be had in making a choice around whether these medicines are the right medicine for you and whether this is the long-term strategy. I've heard a lot of experts, medical experts on this area speak a lot about that for a high proportion of people, when you start these medicines, you're on them for life. Now, that may not be a problem for people. Majority of people who start a statin drug for their cholesterol are on them for life too, unless they choose to stop taking them. That can be because the drug itself, the GLP, isn't going to change your underlying physiology. It's going to suppress it. It's not going to change your underlying psychological and emotional aspects of your eating. It's going to suppress them. And that suppression may actually not be a good thing for you emotionally. So I think, they're not going to be the magic cure for everybody. And we do know that a high proportion of people come off the drugs within 2 years. What we don't know, or I don't know, because I'm interpreting the literature on it, what I don't know is why they come off. So there will be a small group of people who come off because they've achieved their aim. What we do know in those individuals from the systematic reviews is that the majority of them will have put back on 75% of the weight they started with within a year. So we do know that, because as I said, the underlying physiology and the underlying psychological, emotional aspects of food don't change. So when you come off the drug, it makes sense that you would rebound. There will be a small group of people where, like that celebrity you spoke about earlier, who is on starts this to kickstart the process, because maybe being overweight is inhibitory to actually exercising, to actually being able to exercise. But then once you get your exercise patterns going, and you actually you develop willpower with food, then perhaps you can come off and perhaps stimulate GLP in some of the non-medicine ways we spoke about earlier. And perhaps, yes, they will put back on weight, but they may never return to where they were. So I think that's kind of the desirable for a lot of people, is to use this to kickstart. The other thing too, and we see this a lot, Andrew, sometimes you don't realize how comfortably uncomfortable you are until you actually change. And so these drugs may actually show people what it would feel like to be energized, what it would feel like to be more mobile, what it would feel like to feel different about themselves. And that might be enough motivation for them post. But there's a small group of people. So when I look at the sort of curve on the studies, that the average person is putting back on 75%. On the left-hand side of the curve, there are people putting on 25%. On the other side is people putting on 125%. So that's the risk, is that you might rebound. I call that metabolic rebound, where you actually go way worse than where you started.
That mechanism, you're shrinking the fat cells, you're not reducing any of the emotions around this, you're reducing muscle mass, you're metabolically less active, you're not burning as much at rest, you come back to normal homeostasis and your body's going to put on weight. The physiology makes sense behind that.
Yeah, it does. And I think but I think it's okay too. There are some individuals, you have a set point where, I'll give you the opposite example. So, we talk about this a lot. I've been a runner my whole life, long distance runner, never going to be a massive, big, muscly chest like yourself. It's just, and anytime I do put on weight, I don't feel me. Okay, so if I do buff out, I don't feel me. Yeah, and I'll always tend to go back to do enough weights to stay strong and healthy, but I know my sweet spot with my weight. It's about 70 to 71 kilograms. And when I'm 74 or 5, I don't feel me. And when I'm 62 or 3, I know I'm too skinny. So the same can happen to somebody who's been 95 kilograms their whole life. And they may aspire to be this person who's 65 kilograms, and they get down there with these medicines, but they may not feel them. And so for those people, they may come off the medicines to go back to and actually realize that they're quite comfortable being their set weight. So I think there's many reasons why people will come off.
I think that notion of set weight is really important, and we do have that conversation with our coaching clients. My set weight when I was a middle distance runner, just under 6'3", let's say I'm 6'3", I was when I had hair. I was 73, 74 kilos. I was skinny, yeah. But all my mates, I used to hang out with the sprinters, so they used to say I was a sprinter trapped in a middle distance runner's body. So my set weight now is about 93, 94. So I've put on about 20 kilos. But my set waist is 90. So they're the metrics for me. It's sort of just at above 90 kilos, but I like a waist at 90. So it's really important to have that. What you have to do though is, if you are working on a program to put on muscle, or if you're, for most of our listeners would be, okay, how do I lose weight? You've then got to do a reset. You actually do have to recalibrate, and that's another conversation another day, because we're talking about role identity, what you see when you look in the mirror, how everyone knows you. That's a really important factor, is have a set waist first, weight second. That's really important to have that. There are already some downstream effects coming out, looking in the research on this, Cornell University. This backs up what you said, that the genie's not going back in the bottle. There's a lot of benefits that you've spoken about today, physical benefits, psychological benefits, cognitive benefits. And here's some of the changes. An angle nobody saw coming is GLP-1 users are reducing their household spending by approximately 10% across categories like fast food, restaurants and tobacco. Formal wear sales surged 80% and sporting goods jumped 24% in the first 6 months of 2025. So people are wearing more active wear and they are wanting to look sharper when they go to black tie events. Isn't that fascinating? Demand for extra small and small women's clothing sizes has risen 2 percentage points year on year, 2022, 2023, 2024. And analysts say larger sizes will likely be shifted to online as retailers adjust their inventory. So there's some big changes that we're seeing now around clothing, around household, around food. There's more. Nestle have recently launched a frozen food brand specifically targeting GLP-1 users. Restaurant chains are redesigning menus. Food manufacturers, according to CNBC, are pivoting to smaller portions and higher protein lines labelled as being GLP-1 friendly. And final study on this, Morgan Stanley have forecast a 4% decline in soft drink, alcohol and snack consumption over the next decade based on GLP-1 usage. That's fascinating, seeing that effect into multiple industries, food industries, restaurants, clothing, entertainment.
I mean, it's an association, isn't it? It's very hard to. The scientist in me is immediately thinking, but that might be just due to awareness of other aspects of people's lives. But I think if people are feeling better, if people are more functional, if people are happier in themselves and their relationships and everything else that often relates to our body habitus, then it's a plus. It's a plus.
I'm really glad we've had this conversation today. I've learned a lot, both the last couple of months, but really putting this together with you and having the discussion today. And that's what we want for our audience, is to be informed on this. I've got to say, we've had a pretty serious conversation today. Like, sometimes we have a bit more banter. Today's been very loaded with science, and you said that's the angle we wanted to take, and it's the angle we needed to take. So I've got to throw in a few jokes, Tom. I've got some glucose jokes for you. Have you got many glucose jokes in your repertoire?
I have none, so I'm waiting for them.
Well, after this, you may still have none, depending on your response. My glucose monitor and I have a complicated relationship. It's the only thing that judges my life choices on a daily basis. Yeah, it's a response I thought I got. My doctor said my sugar was too high, so when I got home, I moved it to a lower shelf.
That's a joke.
That's horrible.
Joke, that's a joke, but I know of many behaviors people do that are similar to that.
All right. Let's finish on a much more. Let's finish on a more serious note, Dr. Tom. Give us a summary. Give me the Cliff Notes.
Look, I think I want listeners, because some listeners will already be taking the medicines and they'll be wondering, a little bit more about them. I hope it's helped with just informing on what our physiology underneath the medicines is. I want listeners who are not taking the medicine, I want to be really conscious of this GLP pathway, and that actually it's a natural mechanism to switch on and off our hunger, and to be aware that you can regulate that through. Yeah, I know I'm going back a little bit, but eating the protein and fat first in your meal. I talk to our clients all the time about that, because that will keep the GLP higher for longer, and you'll feel fuller for longer. It will also slow down the blood sugar. All those things are working on this mechanism. So there are things we can do outside the medicines to try and optimize our natural GLP mechanism and the leptin Ghrelin balance. So I want listeners to appreciate that link between blood sugar and the cardiovascular events. So here is a medicine that stimulates insulin release, reduces your blood sugar, slows down gastric emptying so you don't get the peaks in your blood sugar, and surprise, surprise, up to a 30% reduction in serious cardiovascular events. So just to be aware of that link. And I want listeners to be aware that this is an option, and if it's done well, it can be transformative. Personally, I think it's regenerative in the body while you're on it. And I guess the question is just to be really clear about the fact that it may be challenging to come off, but that may not be what you're worried about when you start, and you really do need to get yourself in a position where you can then make a choice about weaning or not. I mean, GLP drugs, they aren't a miracle, and I think we just have to be aware that they are probably the most powerful metabolic therapies we've ever had. I think they'll probably be the most prescribed medicine down the road that we've probably ever had as well, probably, be in competition with statins. But like all powerful medicines and all powerful tools we have as humans, the question isn't whether they work. The evidence shows they work. Yeah, the real question is now how we use them, who we use them in, and who gets the most benefit. And I think that's what we'll have a better answer for in 5-10 years' time.
And if I can just add a couple of things, really do that iOS upgrade. So look at the mindset, the thinking, the behavior, the habits. We've done loads of podcasts, so go back through the Performance Intelligence catalog. Go to our website. You can just tap in the word you're looking for, whether it's behavior change, looking at cognition, looking at thoughts. It's a really important part. And I think we need to really give that to our clients. And it's an area, Tom, I think I want to do more in around this, because that's the missing gap. Like you've given us a lot of great information today. Just want to reiterate, you're not a head and a stick. So don't just take the medication. Don't just think that's going to fix everything. You've really got to look at the mindset and the cognition around this.
I'm going to add one other thing in, which I often do when we talk about medicines, is that, anybody listening, don't go buy these on the black market, and don't start injecting your friend's Ozempic into yourself. Make sure that you know what your chemistry is. Make sure you're doing it under guidance. They're sold as a fat loss medicine, but they are physiologically changing your physiology, and you want to know that you're not putting yourself at risk of anything else. So always put that caveat in, because we do this to inform, to motivate, to review the science, to discuss our experience of working with people on them, but we're not advocating you do or you don't.
Yeah, Dr. Tom, thank you. Thank you for your time today, and thank you for the depth and the research you've put into this. It's a very topical area. It's here to stay. The more informed we are, the more informed our clients are. I think the better that is for everybody.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. It's been a great discussion. Thanks, Andrew.